Revelation chapter 3, verses 19 and 20 say this. Those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. So be earnest and repent. Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him, and he with me. The truth is that the Bible says consistently in many places that God disciplines those he loves. He disciplines his sons and his daughters. He disciplines those he cares about. That if he loves you, he disciplines you. And so sometimes he feels like a tough parent. He feels like a really difficult coach. He treats us in a way sometimes that we don't quite understand. I think if we're being honest, it's shocking to us sometimes how tough he is on us. Even on some good things that we don't feel like that he gives to us. Some things sometimes that we feel like these are good things. There's things in our life that we want, that we feel like we need, that we really pray for. Maybe our children have wandered away and have wandered away from the faith, or we feel like there's someone in our family who doesn't know the Lord, or someone in our family who's really sick, or relationships that just never in your family seem to get put back together, or there's people in your family that are dealing with addiction. So many of these things that we want, or want our ministry sometimes to be better or more successful, whatever it is. There's so many things that we want that we feel like are good things, holy things, good things. And God says to us, you can't have them. And there's a crushing sense to us in that. Ligon Duncan preached a sermon a few years ago at the Together for the Gospel conference when he talked about the life of Elijah. And he also mentioned Moses. And he said, Elijah's this great prophet doing so many amazing things, has this encounter with the Baals at Mount Carmel that's just this amazing experience. And then the next day when he's threatened, he runs away scared. And it's just this crazy kind of narrative with us. And we kind of see that in some ways he's so depressed, he can't even walk out of the cave to hear what God is saying to him. And Dr. Duncan, when he's preaching on that passage, says, it's like God says, Elijah, you want these things, these good things. You can't have them. It's like he takes Moses, who took these hundreds of thousands of people through the desert, wandered with them through the desert for 40 years. So many times the Lord wanted to wipe them all out. Moses fell down on his face and interceded for them and prayed for them so that God would save them. And yet it's like God takes Moses and he says, you see the promised land? You can't go in. You can't have it. And Dr. Duncan's takeaway from that is God is really the only one who speaks like that to his people. Almost everybody else in your life is going to say, if you want something, you do it. You deserve it. You deserve the best. You deserve whatever you want. But he said, be careful, because that little whisper in your ear, you deserve everything you want. He said, it comes with a hiss. Because when he sees the servants of God that want good things, and yet God just kind of won't let them have it, he says he knows that's the voice of God so many times. And God seems tough on us, but he's doing it to make us better. In one of my favorite movies called Whiplash, there's this great scene with the teacher called Terrence Fletcher, who's a really, really tough musical teacher, probably too tough on his students. And he's having this encounter with this student named Andrew. And he says, I told you about how Charlie Parker became Charlie Parker, right? And the student says, yeah, Joe Jones threw a cymbal at his head. The teacher says, exactly. Parker's a young kid, pretty good on the sax, gets up to play at a cutting session, and he screws it up. And Joe Jones nearly decapitates him for it. And he's laughed off stage, cries himself to sleep that night. But the next morning, what does he do? He practices and practices and practices with one goal in mind, never to be laughed at again. And a year later, he goes back to the Reno, steps up on stage, and plays the best solo that the world has ever heard. So imagine if Joe Jones had just said, well, that's okay, Charlie, that was okay. good job. And then Charlie thinks to himself, well, you know, I did a pretty good job. End of story. No bird. That to me is an absolute tragedy. That's just what the world wants now. There are no two words in the English language more harmful than good job. To which his student replies, but is there a line? You know, maybe you go too far and you discourage the next Charlie Parker from ever becoming Charlie Parker. To which the teacher says, no, man, no, because the next Charlie Parker would never be discouraged. The next Charlie Parker would never be discouraged. Everybody wants to be Moses. Everybody wants to be Elijah. Everybody wants to be the Apostle Paul, but nobody wants to have to go through what they went through to become them. Nobody wants to have a symbol thrown at their head to be Charlie Parker. But so many times, God to us seems like Joe Jones. It seems like symbols are coming out our head. And we don't understand why he's pushing us so incredibly hard sometimes. And it's tough. He's hard on his servants. He's hard on his people sometimes to try to form us into these amazing people that we can't even imagine or fathom how beautiful of a creature that he's wanting to form us and fashion us into. And yet it's very, very difficult for us to be his friends sometimes. Fred Craddock said one time, Fred Craddock was a famous preacher, and he got stranded one night in a town. And so he woke up the next morning on Sunday. He couldn't fly out until later in the day. So he went to the lady at the hotel and he said, is there a church close by? And she said, yeah, there's one right down the road. And so he said he walked to this church. And he said when he went in, that the preacher walked up to the pulpit, and for the sermon, he started off his sermon by saying, Abraham was a friend of God. I'm glad I'm not a friend of God. And he said that he concluded the sermon by telling the story of Teresa of Avila, who had taken up an orphanage and had raised all of this support and had started this orphanage. And then right after she started the orphanage and got it going, there was a flood, there was a fire, there was all of these things that forced the orphanage to shut down. And Teresa of Avila said this in her prayers one night to the Lord, so this is how you treat your friends. No wonder you have so few. And the old preacher ended his sermon by saying this, if you find yourself being drawn into the inner circle of the friends of God, blessed are you, but pray for the strength to bear the burden of it. Listen, Jesus didn't get treated like we think he ought to have been treated. That's very humbling. If anybody deserved to get treated really, really good in this life, it was Jesus, and he got treated far worse than any of us. Born into a poor family, born into a nothing little town, raised pretty much in obscurity. When he starts his ministry, part of his family thinks he's crazy. His disciples all desert him. And at the end, at the age of 33, he's crucified and killed. If anybody deserved a better life, it was him, and yet he got so little. And yet we know that he was sinless, that he was perfect, and the Father loved him. The Father never turned his back on him. He was so pleased with Jesus, and yet it looked so bad. It looked so bleak. We all want to be Paul. We all want to be Elijah. We all want to be Charlie Parker, but nobody wants a symbol thrown at their head. Nobody wants anybody to deal with them in a tough way. As one of my friends, Heath Cross, always says, everybody wants to have read, but nobody wants to read. That's the way we live our lives. Everyone wants to be this great person, but nobody wants to have to go through the struggles to get to be the great person. Jesus Christ ended up taking the symbol at his head, if you will, and ended up dying for us so that now the discipline that we receive from him, which we read about in Revelations 3, just wakes us up. It's not to kill us. It's not to punish us. It's not God's wrath. It's his loving discipline to wake us up. It's to get us to take action. But being his friend is tough. Because here's the truth. When most of us came to faith in Christ, we came to him because we needed something. We were in trouble. A lot of us meet him in that way. We feel like we're addicted to something, or our finances were terrible, or relationally we were broken, or emotionally we were broken, or we were depressed, and we thought he could help us. So we go to him, and he does. So many times he does, and he helps us. And that starts the relationship. And for a while, it kind of seems easy, and he's leading us along. And then it's as though he kind of lets us go and lets us stand on our own 2 feet. It's like he gives himself some distance to us and kind of forces us to grow up. He maybe disciplines us, or we just don't feel as close to him for a while. And what we have a tendency to say oftentimes is, well, he obviously doesn't love us. He obviously just doesn't care about me. But that's not true. Because again, in this passage it says he disciplines those whom he loves. Hebrews 12 tells us the same exact thing. He disciplines us as his children because he loves us, not because he doesn't love us. And yes, he was difficult on Elijah, and he was difficult on Moses. But in the New Testament, that when you read about Elijah in the Old Testament, it's not the last time you see him. He shows up again in the New Testament at the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, his 3 closest disciples, up on the mount, and he's transfigured before them, and he shows them his glory. And who's there with him? Who appears there with him? Elijah and Moses. Elijah and Moses. God is tough on his friends, but he's amazingly good to his friends. He's amazingly gracious. He's amazingly loving. And yes, he's disciplining us and he's tough on us, but it's because he loves us. It's as you are, it's like, to keep with the analogy of the passage, it's like there's 2 worlds separated by a door. Like when we're being disciplined here, we feel like sometimes he doesn't love us, that this is not for our good, that he couldn't possibly care about us. We couldn't possibly be being changed into a masterpiece. Are you kidding me? I mean, look at us. We look like we're utter disasters. Life seems awful. He's forgotten about us. He's mad at us. But he's knocking. He's trying to get our attention because it's as you were. There's this other door. If you could see the way he's viewing you, if you could see what he knows you're going to be, that's why he's continuing to work on you. There's this great documentary called Searching for Sugarman. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on Netflix. It's a great documentary. And it's a great reminder of that you don't always know what's really going on around you. That there could be a different world in which people are seeing you in a totally different way. It's a story about a singer called Rodriguez. And in the 1970s, he released 2 albums. Everybody that worked with him thought he was going to be a superstar. They thought he was probably the next Bob Dylan. And yet he released 2 records here in the U.S. and they did nothing. But what he didn't know is that around the world, in South Africa, an American girl had taken his album to South Africa and it had become huge. And it had been part of the music that had kind of instigated this musical revolution against the apartheid of South Africa. All these years later, over 20 years later, someone from South Africa finally gets in touch with him. They thought he had died. And finally they found out he was still alive. He was working construction in Detroit. They finally tracked him down, called him and told him, in South Africa, you're bigger than the Rolling Stones. In South Africa, you're bigger than Elvis Presley. And he's taken over there. So many people that worked with him, they couldn't believe how he was viewed. Listen, you're not going to be able to imagine how you're actually viewed by the Lord. You can't imagine what he's wanting to turn you into. All we can see is the here and the now. But there's another world and he's knocking saying, even though I'm disciplining you, I want fellowship with you. The discipline is not to separate us. It's to bring us closer. It's to make us more like him. Listen, he's not disciplining you because he doesn't love you. Think about this. In Israel, the best sheep, the spotless sheep, what happened to them? They got slaughtered. They got killed as sacrifices. Paul in the New Testament says that we are sheep for the slaughter. We're the sheep for the slaughter. If you're a son or a daughter, he disciplines you if he loves you and if you're really his child. So what does he want you to do with the discipline? He wants you to make application with it. There's so many things in our life right now with all the conspiracies floating around about the coronavirus where you hear all these things and you say, okay, that's pretty interesting, but what's the takeaway? What are we supposed to do with it? And there's really nothing we can do with it other than just get mad about it. That's not what Jesus wants out of his discipline. The discipline is not there to make you mad. The discipline is for you to go to the door the discipline is for you to interact with him. It's to wake you up. It gets our attention. This is what C.S. Lewis said. Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, but shouts in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Proverbs 13:1 says, a wise son heeds his father's instructions, but a mocker does not respond to rebukes. So in other words, what is the ultimate application of rebukes? It's to respond to them. It isn't just to go through the motions. As Christians, we can't just say we're being disciplined, so therefore let's just endure it and maybe one day everything will get better. No, he's saying, I'm knocking. I'm knocking. Out of love, I'm disciplining you and I'm knocking. See, we've heard that passage and thought that was talking about something, like evangelistic, like, behold, I stand at the door and knock. He's wanting these people to become Christians. That's written in Revelation to a church. That's written to Christians. This is a passage about waking us up in his discipline, getting us to take action. We need to do something. We need to go up. We've got to meet with Jesus, if you will. We've got to wake up, because sometimes we can be so despondent that we can be like Elijah when he was so depressed in the cave. There was a whirlwind. There was an earthquake. Elijah doesn't even go out to the mouth of the cave. God has to whisper to him to get him to finally even wake up and walk to the cave. And so many of us as Christians are just dead to what Christ is doing in our life. We're not really listening for him that much. We're not paying attention to his voice. We're not listening for him in our lives. And he's sometimes disciplining us and putting struggles in our life to try to see that he's trying to interact with us. He's trying to get us to go up to meet, to interact. And, there's this great story back in the 80s of Larry Walters, who was living out in Los Angeles, and he had always dreamed of flying. Wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. Went to the Air Force Academy in the late 60s, but because of his eyesight, couldn't be a pilot. So decided that he wanted to try to fly. He's the guy, you've probably heard about him, but he had a lawn chair that he tied, I think, 42 weather balloons to, and filled the weather balloons with helium and then floated off. And there were airplanes flying into LAX that saw him at 13,000 feet that radioed in for help. He ended up living through the experience, but they asked him, like, what were you thinking to do something like this so dumb? And he said he had to do something. He wanted to go up. It had always been his dream, and he wanted to do something. He just couldn't sit and do nothing. Discipline is there to wake you up to do something. Even if you don't do it perfectly, if you feel Jesus knocking on the door, do something. Barry Hannah has this great quote about Bob Dylan can't sing, but he has the desperation of not being able to sing, which is better than Glenn Campbell, who can sing. And that's what affects you sometimes, is the attempt at the note, not the hitting the perfect note. It's the attempt at the note. And sometimes the attempt at doing something is what Jesus wants, to get you up, to wake you up. Because he's wanting to turn you into this beautiful work of art. He's wanting to turn you into a masterpiece. And our relationship with Jesus is not simple. It's not simple. Moses' relationship with God was not simple. Elijah's relationship with God, not simple. Peter's, not simple. Our relationship with Christ is not simple. Sometimes he's tough. Sometimes he is so tender. When you read about him in the New Testament, it takes your breath away how tender he is. And then another time you watch him and you see him interact with someone, and he seems very harsh. And he seems very tough. And it breaks your heart sometimes. But that's our relationship with Jesus. It's very complex. It's a wide array of stuff that we have to pull from. And what he wants us to do is to look at our experience and not to sulk about it, but and I love this word, bricolage, to make bricolage, which is a construction or creation from a diverse range of available things. It's like making art out of whatever you have around you. Listen, he's making you into a beautiful masterpiece, and you're supposed to be part of that. You're working on that in yourself. Well, earlier in the year, I really had kind of an epiphany that I was really kind of being foolish by wanting a better life, or a better this, or a better that, or whatever. It was all about the perspective. It's like life is, in a sense, it's like an ink blot test. It's what you make out of it. It's your interpretation of it. And if you decide to spin everything negative, it'll be negative. If you decide to spin most things positive and to see, and then it's positive. And you know what? That doesn't make you some sort of weird prosperity Christian to believe that way. The Bible says that if you're a Christian, all things are happening for our good. All things. Even the Lord's discipline and the difficulties in our life are happening for our good. And that's really, really important for us to remember. So make bricolage, make art. Neil Gaiman said this, make good art. When things get tough, make good art. I'm serious, he says. Husband runs off with a politician, make good art. Leg gets crushed and then eaten by a mutated boa constrictor, make good art. IRS on your trail, make good art. Cat explodes, make great art. Someone on the internet thinks you're stupid or evil or that everything's been done before, make good art. Probably things will work out somehow. Eventually, time will take the sting away, and that doesn't even matter. Do what only you can do best. Make good art. Make it on the bad days and make it on the good days too. It doesn't really matter kind of what's going on and Christ has disciplined you. Turn it into something good. That's what he's wanting. The discipline is not to hurt you. It's to get you to see that he's wanting a deeper fellowship with you, that he's knocking on the door. Great art comes from great pain. So he's being tough on you, but he's being tough on you to get you to wake up. He's trying to turn you into a masterpiece. If you keep saying to yourself, if he would just be easy on me and give me everything I need, then I would really grow and turn into something great. Not true. Great art comes from great pain. Most Christians only ever really tune in and walk over in fellowship with Christ because all the other doors seem closed. And sometimes that's what discipline is turning off all the other doors so that we're forced to see this door where Christ is knocking. There's a passage, Proverbs 10, verse 17. Whoever heeds discipline shows the way to life, but whoever ignores correction leads others astray. Revelation 3 clearly tells us that discipline is trying to get us to make application. It's getting us to take action to fellowship with Christ. What that verse tells us is that not only is it trying to get us to make application, but that application helps or hurts other people. Whoever heeds discipline shows the way to life, but whoever ignores correction leads others astray. Your choice to decide how you want to respond to the discipline of Christ isn't just about you. It's going to affect the people around you. He's trying to shape you into a masterpiece, but you get the opportunity to be able to influence other people. You get the opportunity to share with other people in your life. You get the opportunity, once you've actually been through this discipline and you've grown deeper in your relationship with Christ and you've matured, you get the opportunity to share with people, I've been there, done that. I've been there, done that. I know what that feels like. And you don't have to go into a lot of specifics. You don't have to share that with everybody. But I'll give you a little tip. Here, this is a great way. When you're talking with someone and you want to share with them, you don't have to tell them all the nitty-gritty details if you don't trust them. But you can just say something like, oh, you just started a new job? The last time I started a new job, it was really tough on me. How's it going for you? And then stand back and let them talk. That's all the opening sometimes people need is just, oh, you've been there, done that? You know what it's like? Okay, let me share this with you. That's all they need sometimes. Discipline hurts for a time. It does. But it allows you to help others. And that's really, really important. Peter was told by Christ that he was going to disobey him, that he was going to deny him. But he said, Peter, when you turn, strengthen your brothers. So in other words, Peter, you're gonna deny me, you're gonna disobey me, and you're gonna feel the discipline. When you feel it, turn and strengthen your brothers. Now, why didn't Peter just say, well, Lord, just keep me from turning? I mean, just don't let me go astray. But that's not how Jesus does it. When you turn, Peter, strengthen your brothers. You have the opportunity through your discipline and you're going to the door and fellowshipping deeper with Christ to help other people in their relationship as well. A lot of people say to me, oh man, I'd love to help people. I really want to help people. I mean, if I were rich, I'd give away all my money and I would just help people do all kinds of stuff. I would just be a philanthropist and do all this kind of stuff for people. I would love to help people. I've got a great way that you can help people. I've got a great way that you can help people. Don't give up on them. Keep knocking on their doors. Stand at their door and knock. The New Testament says we are the hands and the feet of Jesus. Well, it's hard to knock on doors with no hands. Most of the time in your life, the way Jesus knocks on your door and wants to bring you back to him is through your friends, through your church members, through your spouse, through your kids, through a family member. It's through somebody else. And you have that opportunity to help someone else grow into who they want to become. Jesus was hurt for us. I mean, really hurt. Hurt so deeply. I'm not just talking about the cross. Hurt so deeply that twice in his life, he had to be comforted by angels that he was so sorrowful. And he knows what it's like to hurt. He knows what it's like to be tempted. And so he can empathize and sympathize with us. If you've been through this process and you've come out better on the other side, you know what that's like too, and now you can help other people. Tim Keller says that when you get married, you go to your wedding ceremony, you stand before the preacher, and he says, your spouse is so full of potential, you can't even imagine what they can become. Like you're so excited to marry him. And he says sometimes over the years, you kind of lose hope of what they are, and you get mad or whatever, but you glimpse it. And you're always hoping that for them. He said, one of these days, you're going to stand before the throne of God in glory. And your spouse is going to be glorified. They're going to have become everything God ever wanted them to be. And you're going to be able to look at them and say, look at you. I always knew you could be like this. I saw so many glimpses of it. I always knew the potential was in you. And to think I got to be a part of the process of how God did this. Use your hands to knock. Don't give up on people. Close with this. If you find yourself being drawn into the inner circle of the friends of God, blessed are you. But pray for the strength to bear the burden of it. Hope you have a good day.